Thank you so much for joining us today for 1 year after Reflections on the Impact of October 7th with Dr. Stephen Windmueller. And I want to thank Congregation BMHBJ in Denver, our great partner, for co-sponsoring today's event, and welcome Rabbi Chaitovsky to introduce today's guest speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone, and Chatima Tova to all, Shana Tova. Nobody wanted to have a presentation this year on this topic, but if we're going to have one, we have perhaps one of the most noted experts who's going to be offering his assessment and his viewpoint on the impact of October the 7th. Dr. Windmueller is a professor emeritus of Jewish Communal Service at the Skirball campus of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in LA, and he has been affiliated with the American Jewish Committee. He directed the Albany Jewish Federation and the JCRC of the Los Angeles Jewish Federation. He's been involved as a director of the School of Jewish Nonprofit Management and was named to the deanship of the LA campus till about 2010. He's written numerous books and articles. He has a PhD in international relations, and his research has been primarily focused on Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, and Jewish political behavior. All of these areas dovetail with what we're going to hear today. He has also lectured in China, offering lectures on American Jewry, and he recently served as guest editor of the Kasdan Institute, producing the impact of Donald Trump's presidency on American Jews in Israel. And he's been a fellow of the Jerusalem Institute of Public Affairs and a board member of the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State, LA. And for the past 8 years, he has been on the faculty of the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, teaching across the globe. Without any further ado, for this very important and timely topic, Dr. Stephen Windmueller.
Thank you, Rabbi Chaitovsky, and thank you, Alex, for hosting us as well. And good afternoon to all of you. We can begin our conversation on how the 7th of October 2023 changed Israel, Zionism, and world Jewry. And no doubt, the events that have transpired even in these last several months continue to reshape not only the Middle East, but have profound implications for America's Jews, America's interpretation of its special relationship with Israel, and certainly this is profoundly important in terms of our understanding of the nature and basis of the most recent forms of anti-Semitism. I think in so many different ways, this past year has been a profound factor in shaping and reshaping much of our lives. The first of which is that we have experienced the single largest outpouring of Jewish financial investment and concern, not only for Israel's safety and security, but even in support of our own communities in terms of the protections required in light of anti-Semitic responses. This is a different kind of fundraising that we have experienced in 2023 and now in 2024. It is the first major campaign that has not been centered with federations, but rather has involved a variety of funders and funding streams, allowing for the wide distribution of dollars to be provided by diaspora Jewry to Israel in many different capacities, for trauma, for medical assistance, certainly for nurturing and dealing with loss and displacement, and the wide variety of very special needs that Israel has encountered during this past year. So we initiate this conversation by simply noting the single most dynamic fundraising year in the Jewish people's history. The second is that on the 14th of November of last year, 290,000 of us would gather in Washington. And as announced today, there appears to be a second planned gathering in DC, again scheduled for November 2024. But these gatherings created that important sense of solidarity and connection to Israel in the months that immediately followed the tragic and difficult events of the 7th of October. And no doubt, the sense of Jewish identity on the part of many of us, but also on the part of what we are going to call the awakening or the return on the part of Jews who were distanced from us, who have, in a sense, seen this year as a call to action and as a response to their own need for community and identity. But this has been a unique and especially important year for our younger generations, Gen Z in particular, those 18 to 35. And we will talk more about their response and reactions and their experiences in the context of this conversation. No doubt, the new anti-Semitism that we have experienced this past year has been of such profound significance that 90% of us have reported in various studies how very much these events have traumatized and triggered our own lives and our own experiences. But no doubt, in this year, there has been a significant body of poetry, not only generated by Israelis, but by others across the Jewish globe in the context of music and art and literature, words and expressions and sounds that have been designed both to support us, but also to give context to what occurred on the 7th of October and what has transpired since. Indeed, when we awakened on the 7th of October, we turned to our neighbors in hopes that we would see the support of many in the non-Jewish community, only to find a wall of silence in many cases. That has pointed us to the clarity and concerns we have about the ability to tell our story, to reach constituencies and to reach influentials well beyond the Jewish community at this particular moment. And that too becomes a challenge as we move forward in terms of how we articulate the messages of the U.S.-Israel relationship, of our responsibility and connection to other peoples and our expectations of them. The effect of all of this on our communal and religious sectors has been significant. It has been a year of challenge to our congregations, to our federations, and to our agencies in terms of their ability to meet the changing dimensions and needs of constituencies who are relating to these various and respected institutions. I referenced the awakening because it is significantly important. Rabbis, educators, and communal professionals across the United States are informing us today of the significant numbers of folks who are reconnecting to Jewish life, whether it's about learning about Zionism and Israel, or whether it is about affiliating with congregations, communities, and schools, or whether it is about their donations to Jewish causes and to Israel. The awakening is something we cannot yet catalog in terms of numbers, but we can identify the various perspectives of what it looks like, why it is happening, and what it ultimately may mean. We did come together, as I suggested, on the 14th of November, but for many of us, the months that would follow, from January through to the summer, we would see a huge disconnect amongst many within our community, as this ability to hold our community together would see a splintering in terms of generational divisions, along with deep and abiding concerns over Israel's strategy, case, and cause in this particular moment. What we would also identify and note at this point is our many disappointments. The failure, as we suggested in our last slide, for many outside of the Jewish community to rally there for us. The rise of voices both in the Congress and outside of the Congress who were critical of Israel and critical of support by the United States for Israel. This political divide has been significant internal to the Jewish community, just as it is amongst Americans and others in a much broader context. It has, in a sense, meant Zionism has been placed on a trial format, where generations are in conflict over what it may mean, how it is to be understood, and how we defend or interpret it. And indeed, for younger American Jews, Gen Zs in particular, this has been a test at the university level and beyond in terms of how they relate to fellow students, how they either embrace Israel or have walked away from Israel during the months of March and April, where some 147 American universities experienced various forms of civil disobedience, of various types of sit-ins, of demonstrations, and of attacks directed against Jews and Israel at a time of great upheaval. Indeed, we live at this moment with 101 unknown questions, the 101 hostages that remain, and the issue of their survivability, their return to peace, home, and safety, and the capacity of this conflict in Gaza to find a successful conclusion, both militarily and in the context of the preservation of life for our hostages. I refer here to the extraordinary and significant growth of anti-Semitism, with the ADL's latest incidence report indicating some 8,873 acts of anti-Semitism toward Jews, Jewish institutions, and as a result, a 140% increase over the prior year. It is a major statement about a new kind of anti-Semitism. It is an anti-Semitism that is not about the personhood of Jews, that is their individual characteristics. It is about the collective Jewish people. It is about the existence and viability of Israel. It is about the notion of Jews having power and too much of it. It is an assault on Jews in terms of their love and support of Zionism, Israel, and other Jewish causes. It is a very real and definitive statement that younger Americans, more so than older Americans, hold anti-Semitic views. Today, 24% of Americans carry anti-Semitic perspectives about our community and about us. There has as well been for us the notion that many American Jews have become frustrated and angered and fearful of what they are experiencing. And part of that has been directed in a kind of contested way in terms of feeling that the Jewish institutions have in part not served them well in response to all of the anguish that many Jews are feeling and facing. In some measure, we need to think about what all of this may mean in terms of where we are and where we need to go. Here, I would point to 7 principles. The first is security, the ultimate objective and concern that every Jewish community and every Jewish institution must have is first and foremost for the welfare and safety of those who participate in its walls. And that security has become a major challenge and agenda item for every Jewish community in the diaspora, and more dramatically for American Jewry over the past 12 months. The second agenda is education, the ability to inform and embrace the questions that our young people are asking, and to reintroduce Zionist education, Israel studies, and Jewish historical context to audiences that may be concerned that they do not have a full and complete picture of the Israel story and its evolution, development as a state, its place in the Middle East, and its context as part of the history of Jewish peoplehood and of Jewish culture. We, as we have noted before, have an obligation to deal with advocacy and building partnerships, and this work must continue. It continues now in a very different frame than it did even 12 months ago, in finding new partners, in re-educating those that were our partners, in holding accountable folks that once were perceived as allies and friends, and dealing with communities of both color and of religion, who in so many different ways require us to be present and in partnership with them if we are to rebuild these valued and important connections. This is a moment for crisis management, of planning and preparedness. This reminds us of how underprepared we were on the 7th of October and how by necessity we will need to be in a more proactive frame in terms of our preparations institutionally, communally, and even internationally as a Jewish people in managing such provoked and unprovoked crises. This is also clearly about memorializing. And the events just this week, the anniversary of the 7th of October, remind us of the power of memory and the power and importance of this experience. Our ability to connect with other Jews in reliving and re-experiencing the lives of those that were lost, and in praying for and hoping for the return of those who are still captive, and in dealing with the displacement of Israelis, the literally thousands of Israelis who no longer are able to return to their homes safely and securely. This moment of memorializing is powerful. It is Jewish in every sense of the word, and it is the important sort of component of who we are as a people, to recall, to remember, and to maintain that sense of connection to those who are bereft. This is also a period of economic and social assistance, not only to the many displaced Israelis, but to an Israeli economy that has been clearly shaken by these events and by the mobilization of literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of its young men and women in terms of military obligations and social responsibilities, and the capacity of diaspora communities to assist Israel in this social and economic crisis. But it is also a reality here in our communities. As many of our institutions, we learned, made conscious decisions not to fundraise for their specific causes and purposes in the name of the collective interests of the Jewish people, only now to find themselves in serious economic and critical concerns about their viability as well. So we have a duality here of economic obligations, both to Israel and to our own communal institutions, synagogues, and organizations. This is also a moment about rethinking our priorities and our interests as a community. And this is in part is reflected in the behaviors and expectations we have over the November election, but beyond the November election in terms of how the pro-Israel community and the advocates for Israel, whether embracing all that Israel stands for or simply the idea that the Jewish state must survive and must be allowed to find its way forward, requires us to acknowledge our differences while acknowledging our commonalities in terms of our political interests. I want to step back here for one moment to remind us that the American Jewish community itself has changed, and this year simply has accentuated some of those changes. In 1985, we began a process of creating a whole new generation of institutions, which I call here the boutique model. Indeed, from 1880 to 1920, we would create the legacy institutions, American denominations, Jewish denominationalism, the American Jewish Federation System, our JCCs, our bureaus of Jewish education, our social and human service institutions, our cultural and educational organizations. Those legacy institutions have served us well, but a whole second category of institutions has emerged. We believe as many as 600 of these single issue institutions have been born, and you will know many of them, and many more are present in your communities and shaping our lives and influencing our structures. For example, Mazon was created in 1985. The American Jewish World Service, also created in 1985. J Street, the Jewish response to hunger, as well as a host of climate, Israel-based, public policy and social justice organizations, all of which had a founder who framed a single issue as a basis for the formation of a cause, and who created institutions that today rival and in some measure compete with many of the legacy organizations. And that has changed the whole character and fiber of the American Jewish community today. where we have many different avenues and ways by which to be pro-Israel or active on behalf of Israel or even critical of Israel, just as we have institutions that deal with a whole array of approaches to social justice, to culture, to Jewish spirituality, and to an array of other agendas that define the shaping and the construct of this new boutique model of Jewish life. I think we cannot place this year in a kind of siloed position. We need to understand that much of what has happened and is happening to Jewish life in the United States and elsewhere has been driven by factors before and during this period, including the 2008 economic recession, which fundamentally changed many of our organizations and shifted a lot of our priorities and capacities as a result of the economic crisis of that period. No doubt the social media revolution has fundamentally changed the way many of us and many of our children receive news, understand news, and distribute information. And the arrival of Gen Zs are very profoundly important, especially in this moment as they rebel against us around Israel at some point, or where in other cases they have engaged in deep and embracing fashions in support of Israel. But regardless of where they sit, it is a unique generation that is driven by a variety of behaviors fundamentally different from anything the American Jewish community has seen. For example, it is a generation of religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, none of the above. Many of our young folks who have grown up in Reform, conservative, and secular homes have basically declared themselves sort of outside of the religious character of the Jewish community. Others who have come to our community in that cohort have struck very strong challenges to us around Israel, arguing that Israel has failed to live up to what they were taught in terms of tikkun olam and social justice imperatives, which they feel Israel has violated. So we have a huge challenge and struggle in many circles in terms of how we reconnect with this generation. And the broader public and political upheaval in this country no doubt adds further tension and challenge to us around both the Israel case, but certainly with regard to November's election. We have experienced since the pandemic two very extraordinary phenomena. We have for the first time in liberal American Judaism what we might call the rise of the national synagogue, the virtual synagogue. And there we would cite Central Synagogue in New York, which is reporting literally hundreds of thousands of attendees on Yom Kippur, or Park Avenue Synagogue in New York, which reports significantly large numbers as well, and a variety of other congregations that today in some measure might be called national synagogues operating in virtual spaces that have profoundly changed the nature of American liberal religious life. And the second category is privatized Judaism. Here we find the hundreds of websites where people are telling us that they are finding a way of learning and connection and engagement through these web platforms, which allow them to study Torah, which give them an opportunity to learn Jewish history, which offers them a kind of cultural insight into Jewish foods and behaviors and experiences. All of this is thereby changing the landscape of the Jewish community, just as we are dealing with the larger issues of the imprint of the 7th of October. And all of this must be understood in our broadest context. I think what all of this may mean for us is framed in this particular slide. In some measure, this is a very new moment for us. Part of that moment is driven by the fact that Americans today have lost trust in many of the institutions that once held sway as powerful and influential in their lives. And that includes political organizations, religious institutions, cultural and educational. As a result, we are struggling to find ways to tell our story because the new reality suggests that traditional modalities of influence are no longer necessarily having an impact. And that is particularly challenging for a community that is dependent on the mainstream societal organizations to convey many of our messages and our beliefs and our relationships, including the Israel-American relationship. In some measure, we are dealing with a kind of political homelessness. That homelessness is driven in part by the far left, which is critical of Israel and challenging to us, and the far right, which is as likewise is raising new and dangerous challenges to the welfare of minorities, in particular Jews. Both groups raise the question, are Jews white people? The far right suggests, as they did in Charlottesville in 2017, that Jews are seeking to replace us. And that was the phrase they use. Jews will not replace us. Replacement theory for the far right suggests that Jews are moving to take power, replacing white Anglo-Saxons by themselves imposing themselves in power and bringing with them their own allies. Jews are seeking in their minds to become white. For the far left, the challenge has been that folks on the far left see Jews as no longer a minority, but part of the merit and energized white class, part of those who have achieved power, who are colonialists, who are racist, who are apartheidists. And as a result, for the postmodernists on the far left, Jews are part of the establishment and thereby part of the problem. So this has changed the fundamental characteristics of how Jews are seen in the American political spectrum. And indeed, the cohort to all of this is that Zionism is the target, that Jews are perceived as Zionists and by definition, therefore, are unwelcomed and unwanted, and that Zionism itself is a colonialist and apartheid philosophy created and established to force the folks living in Palestine / Israel into a kind of endangered and no longer a viable and independent capacity to rule and to rule themselves. So Palestinians and Israelis in conflict is seen as efforts by white Zionists to control the Palestinian question. I think in so many ways that sadly but clearly summarizes that October 7th has meant so many different things to so many of us, but it means in the end, ultimately, the very question of our American Jewish standing and status. So Alex, why don't we move away from the slides and welcome. I look forward to hearing from as many of you who may have thoughts or questions, and we can go from there.
Hi, Harold, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I have, well, it's a comment and a question. And I was interested in your comments about education. Do you think that the education of Jewish young people, starting at the childhood preschool stage, should be changed from the traditional Hebrew school, whatever that means, to schools of Jewish history with a minor in traditional Hebrew school, as a way of the younger people understanding the history of the Jews and better understanding the history of what is currently going on in the Middle East?
Thank you, Harold. I'm not sure that the burden falls here on the traditional Hebrew schools or even day schools, and certainly not in any measure on the American Orthodox Jewish community. I think this is a burden that's borne by Reform and conservative congregations and movements. And I think it's a burden as well for the secularists within our midst as well. So I sense we have to sort of break away the principle that all of Jewish education is problematic. My sense is that what we have done in liberal circles is much more challenging because we've sort of created an artificial Israel. We've created an imagery of a state that was perfect in so many ways, We've created an imagery of a society that was achieving social justice. And when we know that that there are huge challenges in the Middle East dealing with the significance of Israel's enemies, of the difficulties of dealing with Israel sustaining and growing and nurturing its democracy, when we understand the complexity of a society that's made up of Jews with very different backgrounds and different expectations of what the Jewish state ought to represent. And we need to tell the complexity of that story to young people in ways that they can understand it and in ways that they can appreciate that complexity does not mean that you don't engage with it. It means you need to be that much more understanding of all of the competing ideas and themes that are in play. And that becomes one task. The second task is that I'm not sure that any of us have done a particularly good job on Jewish history and how we come to understand the 20th century or even now the 21st century. And it raises really interesting questions about how we've, in some measure, created a kind of fictionalized history of the Jewish people. And in ways we may need to return to a much more robust and complex picture of that historical experience as a way to help younger people understand what they are living with and why these societal issues are so challenging, but at the same time so important. So I just would modify your proposal to take into account that I think there are specific audiences and specific kinds of needs that are required.
I just want to say that that was an excellent presentation. I really, really enjoyed it, and it was you hit on everything. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Anne. I appreciate that. Appreciate that. I hope it generated some thoughts and questions as well. For me, I think the Gen Z issue is the most challenging, no doubt. I would also tell you that I think we are hardly at the end of this moment, and that's very difficult for an audience to hear because generally we've seen crisis managed in shorter terms, and Israel in particular has managed its wars and its conflicts in relatively short periods. This is the longest sustained conflict in Israel's history. And it has many pieces to it still unresolved, whether we talk about Hezbollah in Lebanon, whether we talk about Iran itself, all of the other proxies that are associated with the Iranian regime. And with it comes other challenges that we have not seen before, including the potential role that other major powers in the world will be playing in the Middle East, China amongst them. And other nation states as well.
Is this going to be recorded? Are we going to get the recording?
Yes, it will be recorded, and we will share it on our website.
I want to send it to my kids.
For sure.
Thank you.
I'll share the link in the chat as well.
Professor, I have a question. It's nice to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you.
In training the next generation of Jewish leadership, what are some areas that you think we'll need to rethink in terms of how one can be critically adaptive to some of the unforeseen trends in the coming decades, and how we can prepare those steering the communities, whether that's federations, camps, schools, clergy, to be most equipped for that? One thing I did hear you say was a more nuanced understanding of Jewish history, and I wonder what else you might add to that.
Thank you. I would say that this critical adaptation that you referenced really applies to our ability to push back in some measure against what our younger folks are experiencing with just social media, where social media provides for them their entire context, their friendship circles, their news agencies, their elements about what truth is and what truth is not, and their beliefs about what institutions to trust and not to trust. And so we have the first task is to, in a sense, create some balance here between that world and the, shall we say, the historic world of the Jewish people. That is a rich and dynamic history that somehow has gotten pushed away or pushed back from the mainstream of thought and of insight on the part of younger American Jews. So the ability to reintroduce into the sort of public square, if you wish, a more critical educational system as a whole, which hopefully will then have a Jewish piece to that specifically, that allows people to ask the whys, the whos, the whats, in the context of these issues, and not simply to either accept material or reject it, but to want that inquiry that is so much a part of Jewish tradition as we know, and we ought to sort of celebrate and encourage that. The second part of that is that we need to invest, and here again I turn to the public sector, because American students as a whole and Jewish students as a case study are far less knowledgeable about civics, government, the role of these institutions in our lives, and not many states require today the teaching of civics. Only 17 of the 50 states have a requirement that civics be taught. And I think that's part of why we see so much sort of under education or misinformation about educational data, because folks simply are not attuned to how systems work, how governments work, and how societies operate. And that's the broader issue, but it has implications for American Jews and for the next generation of Jewish learning. And a third piece to this is very much what I have learned from my friends at the Church of Latter-day Saints. In some measure, what the Mormons are teaching us is experience, the mission, the 2 years of a young person. In the case of men, it's 2. In the case of women, it may be 1. And I don't mean the 10-day birthright experience. I mean the introducing our kids to actually living in and working in communities, Jewish communities, but it could well be beyond Jewish communities, to better understand how the systems of life and of culture work, and where students can actually experience opportunities of seeing other cultures or their own culture, managing and the challenges that we face, so that it's not something that's theoretical, but becomes very much practical. And so what the church has done is to sort of require that as a piece of the learning curve for a 17 to 19-year-old. And why not have some similar expectations for young Jews to have to experience something much more robust than simply experiencing a 10-day free trip to Israel, but to experience working in community, doing the work of community in ways that I know even in your organization, where social justice is a piece of your agenda, where that becomes very much a given example. So in these kinds of ways, I think we begin to move in the direction of critical thinking, engagement on the ground, and a richer and broader knowledge of how civics and governments work.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Rabbi.
Yes, thank you. A friend of mine who's a pretty accomplished reporter took a position with the Jewish Forward to spend time on the ground in Israel during this past year, at the peak of the conflict, and really enmeshed in all the goings on. And she made an interesting observation, and she's very much on the left, although that's been tempered a little bit in her own opinion. But she said that from her perspective, what she noticed in Israel there was it's the older generation, however you want to define that, a previous generation, they're the ones who are doing most of the protesting. The younger generation is much more gung-ho about almost like Israel right or wrong, if you want to use that phrase. And it's almost the opposite here, where here the older stage generation is very, very emotionally involved and you know, Israel must survive, etc. It's the younger generation that is protesting, and you call Generation Z, which the rabbi we talked about before, Rabbi Amiel Hirsch says, you know, where do we go wrong? Where did we go wrong? We have lost Generation Z. Is that did I quantify that the right way? Is that the divide there and the divide here? It's almost like the opposite.
Yeah, it's a fascinating observation and probably very true. And we can tell with regard to Israeli society by the polling data we have and by even voting behavior we have, where older voters and older participants in Israeli society are much more, in a sense, establishment and see that the state has changed and they are struggling with what the changes are, and as a result are on the streets very much vocal about much of what has happened and is happening. And that younger Israelis have tended to be politically more aligned with the current government in some measure, and we see some of that in polling, where especially younger Israelis who've grown up inside the more religious systems of Israel are very much Zionist committed and bound to many of the ideals of what has now become what we call Zionist nationalism or religious Zionist nationalism. So yes, that's true on the Israeli side. On the American side, I think your observation is interesting as well, that here the older American Jewish established community has accepted Israel with all of its warts and challenges because they understand that it is about the state, its survivability, and its continuity, and are less engaged or less necessarily believe they have a role to play in defining the outcomes of what kind of Israel we ought to see or have. And younger American Jews, quite the reverse, feeling that this idea was sold to them with some miscalculations. And as I think Rabbi Ami Hirsch is absolutely correct in terms of how he has described a generation that we have lost or are losing. And listening to and reading the sermons of many rabbis over these high holy day periods, I see many of them addressing their children or grandchildren in the context of their sermons, speaking to the question of coming home, bringing them back into a fold where they know that these kids are struggling with the idea of Zionism, the question of whether a Jewish state is really the Jewish state that they had understood or believed in, and whether or not such a state ought to even exist. Which is really challenging to older Jews and to an older generation with such notions. So I think you're absolutely right. We see these almost opposite postures or positions by these age cohorts in these two societies, reflecting some very different challenges here as against in Israel.
Do you think there's a way to carve out room for rapprochement or conversation between the almost polar opposite? Like, is there a middle ground where questions and difficulties can come up even as there is a pride and dedication and loyalty to the survival of Israel, et cetera, et cetera? Is there conversation? Are people working towards that, both there and here?
Yeah. It's interesting, Rabbi. I'm right now working on an article that specifically deals with this question of, can we have conversations across these deep and very real barriers? And the irony of a community that has created now literally numerous organizations, part of this boutique model that I just spoke about, including Resetting the Table, which is one of them, but many others that have come into being and are being actually created as we speak by major donors who see this as the fundamental challenge to the Jewish community, the inability of Jews to talk with one another, whether it is about Israel or about any number of any number of other themes that may be aligned with this issue. And so the goal of Resetting the Table, as just an example, is the art of listening and giving all of us the tools to hear one another before we respond and move away from our emotional response, which is normally the first step we would take, which is, how dare you say that kind of thing, as against stepping back to understand, well, why is this person saying it? What does it mean for him or her? How can I understand and at least reach that point of connection with them to know that this is really bothering them. Even if they share a view I disagree, they're sharing it because they are struggling so much with the problem behind the issue. And I think these conversations that are nurtured and managed and treated seriously may be the next step for many of us in trying to hear one another and find, as you suggest, some kind of common ground or place for our coming together. We will be together in 2 weeks, and some of what I dealt with in pieces of this presentation will be carried much deeper in our second conversation when we talk about the 2024 election and the American Jewish political experience. Because I think that there's a piece to all of what we are just living with now in this conversation that also has a very special place, if you wish, in the larger context of American politics.
Yes, thank you for that point. I'm going to share a link in the chat for anyone who would like to register for your next class with us on October 31st. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Windmueller. We are so honored to learn with you and are really looking forward to your next class on October 31st as well. Just to let everyone know, we also have a class on Monday, October 14th with Dr. Johnny Schnitzer at 10 a.m. Pacific time called Mount Sinai, What Happened to Whom and When. So we hope you can all join us for that as well. And want to wish everyone a Shana Tova and Gemar Chatima Tova as well.